Episode 23, All Roads Lead to Dien Bien Phu. And yes, you heard it right. I did say Dien Bien Phu, which shows that we are now closer to the end than to the beginning of our series on Indochina. And today, we're going to begin our last lap, if you want, in mid-1953. What we'll see today is that the French were in a very tough position in 1953. On the one hand, they wanted out of a war that was killing its army at an alarming rate, and they were finding it tougher to push back against the demands of independence made by Bao Dai and other non-communist Vietnamese nationalists. On the other hand, the US wanted them not only to stay put, but to go on the offensive against the communists. So let's start on a domestic front. In 1953, France was tired of the war. You know, way back in 1946, the French had entered the war to recover their colony of Indochina. But to give to their action the veneer of legitimacy, France claimed to the US that it was fighting to stop communism. And to their non-communist Vietnamese nationalists, France promised independence, but gave them nothing but independence. In 1953, though, France no longer wanted to pretend to fight communism because it had suffered massive casualties. Picture this. In 1953, the French had lost to date 3 generals, 8 colonels, 18 lieutenant colonels, 69 majors, 341 captains, 1,140 lieutenants, 3,863 non-commissioned officers, and 6,000 soldiers. And those figures do not include the 12,000 African soldiers and legionnaires, as well as 14,000 Vietnamese soldiers, Laotian soldiers, and Cambodian soldiers who were fighting on the French side. And at the same time, the war was having a massive impact on the French budget. So, domestically, the French had enough. In Indochina itself, the French had partnered with anti-communist nationalists in Vietnam, with a king that they put on in Laos and in Cambodia. But these guys no longer believe French promises either. Let's take Cambodia, for example. Norodom Sihanouk embarked on what he called the crusade for full independence. And Norodom Sihanouk proclaimed the independence of the Kingdom of Cambodia on the 9th of November 1953. In Vietnam, Bao Dai did not go on a crusade. However, the relations between the French Republic and the Associated State of Vietnam deteriorated as well in 1953. As we've seen last week, the main event was the devaluation of the piastre that we talked about last episode. That decision, that if you remember, was a unilateral French decision, weakened even more the Bao Dai government led by Prime Minister Nguyen Van Tam. And after that, Bao Dai started demanding more guarantees of independence from the French. But the nationalists behind Bao Dai were a very divided bunch with competing agendas. You had your political and religious groups, you had the Dai Viet Party, you had trade unions led by Ngo Dinh Diem. You had trade unions led by Ngo Dinh Nhu, who was none other than Ngo Dinh Diem's brother. You had Catholic groups in the north led by very militant bishops. And Prime Minister Tam was unable to keep his church in order, and more radical nationalist demands were coming from everywhere. What was France's response to that swell of nationalism? Well, the least that you can say was that it was underwhelming. On the 3rd of July 1953, the French minister in charge of the Associated States made a declaration, and he said that France was happy to renegotiate and to quote-unquote fine-tune the independence given to the Associated States. I mean, fine-tune. What on earth does it mean? And radical nationalists went berserk and started agitating independently from Prime Minister Tam and Bao Dai. The Cao Dai Party, the Binh Duyên, and Catholic trade unions behind Golden New convened a National Congress of Unity and Peace in September 1953. The Congress demanded unconditional independence and a National Assembly elected by all citizens. That Congress had not been vetted by Bao Dai, and Bao Dai felt that he was losing control here, and he had to react. So he convened a Vietnamese National Congress in October 1953 with two objectives. One, give a formal response to the Minister Reynaud, who talked about fine-tuning. And number two, appoint negotiators who would go and get real independence from France. But when the Congress was convened, things went a bit out of hand, because in the Congress chaired by one of Bao Dai's cousins, Prince Bu Lok, the Congress went far beyond what Bao Dai wanted. It demanded that the election of a new National Assembly with the power to renegotiate treaties with France. And above all, the Congress voted to exit the French Union. And as you can imagine, that didn't go well in Paris. The French were furious. They played all the familiar tunes. After all our sacrifices, this is how the Vietnamese repay us. And Bao Dai, who was staying in the French Riviera at the time, was summoned to Paris like a school kid to the principal's office. The thing is that the Vietnamese congressman really wanted to get American support. However, in choosing between the French and Vietnamese nationalism, the US chose the French. The US were not interested about talking about independence before the fight against the communists was won. The American ambassador in Saigon did like the French in France. He summoned Prince Bu Lok and all the other congressmen and gave them an earful. He called them naive and asked them to show more maturity. Basically, tone it down, guys. There's a war against communism going on. Let's talk about independence again after we defeat the communists. And if you want to talk about the Americans, the Eisenhower administration's objective was clear in Indochina. France had to continue its war effort, and for that to happen, the nationalists in Saigon had to lay low for the time being. And to drive that point home and show the French that they had American support in this war, Eisenhower sent to Vietnam his own vice president, a guy named Richard Nixon. So the American was very quick to shut down Vietnamese nationalists. What the American wanted was the French to continue fighting once again. Even though after Stalin's death in March 1953 and the ceasefire in Korea in July, the atmosphere was one of détente. The communists were sending signals that they were open to negotiation, and France was listening, especially after the Korean truce. The French High Command was very worried that now that the Korean War was over, the Chinese will put more resources and troops on the Vietnamese front. And they wanted to avoid direct confrontation with China. In fact, they should not have worried because the Chinese too wanted to avoid a direct confrontation with an ally of the US and, God forbid, with the US themselves. China wanted to stop fighting and devote more resources to its domestic challenges. And there's something else. You must remember that Communist China was a new country, not recognized by the US. So what China really wanted was normalization. That's why in the autumn of 1953, Moscow and Beijing made it very clear to Ho Chi Minh that he should be open to negotiations if they happen. And Ho Chi Minh was okay with that. The DRV had at that point been fighting for 8 years, and they were open to a negotiated settlement. Ho Chi Minh said so in an interview with the Swedish newspaper Expressen on the 29th of November. And on 19th of December, the Lao Dong Politburo approved a resolution calling for the opening of a new front in the war, the negotiation front. And as a reminder, the Lao Dong is the Communist Party. Opening a negotiation front did not mean laying down arms. Quite the opposite. Negotiations meant more frantic military activity because it was always better to negotiate from a position of strength. The Vietnamese and the Chinese agreed that they had to score a major military victory before sitting at the negotiating table. So, okay, the DRV was happy to negotiate again. What did the French say? Well, the National Assembly rejected any immediate negotiation with the Viet Minh. But what they said is that they were happy for multilateral talks on Indochina involving the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union. The French hoped to put Indochina on the agenda of the Berlin Conference scheduled for February of 1954. But to get there in a position of strength, General Navarre, the new French commander, had to turn things around on the ground as well. So what we have in 1953 is that both the French and the Vietnamese are looking forward to some kind of talks, but they both wanted to strike a big victory before sitting down to parley. So let's start on the French side and the new commander-in-chief, Navarre. Navarre arrived in Indochina in May of 1953. He was a veteran of the two great wars, World War I and World War II, but he had never been to Indochina, and he was given the following mission. He was asked to create on the ground conditions favorable to an honorable exit. That's a lot of jargon, right? Well, basically he was said to go win the war, but at the same time he was told, oh, and by the way, don't expect to receive any reinforcements. Do your best, what you have already got. Allez, bonne chance. Good luck with that, mate. And one of the best analogies I heard about Navarre, and I'm jealous I didn't think about it before, was in the excellent podcast Shadow of Utopia by Lachlan Peters. Peters' topic is the Cambodian genocide, but he makes a very deep dive and he takes detours to talk about Vietnam. Peters compares Navarre to a soccer coach appointed mid-season. Think a Premier League team in danger of getting relegated to the Championship, for example, and picking up the phone and calling Sam Allardyce. So Big Sam arrives and say, okay guys, here's my plan. This is Navarre talking now. Well, Navarre's plan was a two-stage plan. What he envisaged was that in 1953-54, he'll avoid large-scale operations and focus on rebuilding his army to make it battle-ready. Then, in 1954-55, Navarre planned to strike hard and crush the DRV so hard that Ho Chi Minh will have no choice but beg for a ceasefire. So, Navarre's plan was no large-scale battle before 1955. Navarre arrived during the rainy season, and you and I have been here before. Nothing significant happens between May and October, when the rainy season ends. So Navarre launched Operation Swallow, Operation Seagull, Operation Pelican, but that's nothing. Just really small scale operation. The real question on Navarre's minds was, what were General Giap's plans for the fighting season? And he had three possibilities. The first option for the Vietnamese was to attack the Red River Delta. A second possibility was for the DRV to push towards central Vietnam. And the third option was another push, but then towards northwest, towards the Laos border. In October, French intelligence noticed that the 316th Division, which specialized in mountain operations, was marching towards Lai Châu, the capital of the Thai country, which was an indication that the DRV wanted to strike again in Laos. The French could not afford to see Luang Prabang fall. Luang Prabang was the capital of the Laotian king, Sitavang. And this guy was one of the most loyal French allies. So for the French, it was absolutely crucial to defend Laos. Yet, the real objective of the DRV was only the Thai country. The DRV wasn't interested in invading Laos, but they wanted to set foot in the northwest, in the Thai region. At the fourth plenum of the Workers' Party of Vietnam in January 1953, and then in October during a secret meeting, the DRV strategists determined that it was necessary to strike the enemy where he was weakest. Why? To disperse his troops as much as possible, and if possible, very far from the Red River Delta. This strategy was endorsed by the Chinese Big Brother, whose aid, by the way, was increasingly important. It went from 250 tons of equipment per month in 1952 to 450 tons in 1953. But it was still very far from the 8,000 tons that the Americans were giving the French every month in equipment. So the strategy is to spread the French troops thin. And to describe it, Ho Chi Minh compared the French forces to a hand. In the Red River Delta, the hand was closed like a fist, and it was capable of unleashing very powerful punches. The objective of Vietnamese was to loosen the hand by forcing the French to spread their fingers. And if the French were forced to spread their forces thin all over Indochina, then it would be easier to break the fingers one by one. So the decision was taken, focus on the northwest, and that is why General Giap did not take the bait when Navarre launched Operation Seagull in the south of the Red River Delta. No, what Giap did was take the initiative and send the 316th Division towards the Lai Châu region. And it was maybe to respond to this threat that General Navarre responded by sending paratroopers to occupy a valley called Dien Bien Phu. Why Dien Bien Phu? Well, the valley was on the most likely route of an invasion of Laos. And you could strike two birds with one stone. You could set up there an air-land base, just like they did in Nassan, and crush the DRV just in time for the negotiation that were coming. And that it would get the Americans off your back as well. Initially, the French thought about setting up their base in Lao Châu, which was the capital of the Thai country, led by Deo Van Long, but it was too close to the Chinese border, so they scrapped that idea. But they still thought that they could use Thai and Hmong tribes, those ethnic minorities. They could use those ethnic minorities against the Viet majority. And indeed, Dien Bien Phu was in the heart of Thai country, where the French had special force units, where Thai and Hmong fighters were under French command. And let's not forget at the end, I'm not sure how significant this is, that the Thai and Hmong were the main suppliers of opium. And the opium trade was known to fund many French covert special operations. So taking Dien Bien Phu also meant getting a better control of opium trade. So let's recap. Why Dien Bien Phu? One, because it is on the shortest route to Laos, and that Laos had to be protected from a Viet Minh invasion. Two, to do this, the best strategic option was the hedgehog, just like in Nassan. One outpost surrounded by several armed positions. And you could provoke an enemy, frontal assault, and you win. But that doesn't tell us why Dien Bien Phu ended up being the decisive battle of the war, even though the Navarre plan did not foresee major confrontations before 1955. We'll see that next week. But what we can say today is that first, when General Giap sent his 316 divisions towards the northwest, he did not expect to fight the last battle of the war either. Similarly, when General Navarre launched Operation Castor on 20th of November 1953 to occupy Dien Bien Phu, he did not think for 1 minute that he was digging his own grave. So what we'll see next week is that that small military maneuver will trigger a series of actions and reactions in Vietnam, in France, in the US, in Europe, and next thing you know, Dien Bien Phu will be the deciding factor to end the Indochina. But that we'll see next time. Until then, be well and goodbye.